These are the ways that I'm looking at how do we improve our workplaces? How we make going to work a healthier, more productive? I mean, people want to achieve, right? It's not like people don't want to get stuff done. It's theory X versus theory Y. I'm very much in that camp, in the theory Y camp. So lead without. And the point of view of this talk is that leaders are everywhere. There are formal leaders with organizational job titles and things that we look at as leaders, but there are also informal leaders. And there are leaders who are intermittent. I step into leadership when these things are on the table, and then I let somebody else step into leadership and I become a follower, which I think is a leadership role, actually. But so that someone else who has more expertise or brings more to the table in the moment can be the leader now, right? So some of us are leaders, looked at as leaders all the time. Some of us it's intermittent, but leaders are everywhere in our organizations and in our society. So this is just simply challenging. I guess I have to stay over here.
It's me, I think. I'm sorry.
Okay. So sometimes when I talk about leadership, people say, oh, that's just happy feeling stuff. That's fluffy buttons. That's not real, practical, work-related kind of stuff, right? Well, called me a couple of different names over my career. But one of them is a variation on either a visionary pragmatist or a pragmatic visionary. And the thing is, I am very pragmatic. I look at these issues because I want to see different results than I have been seeing. I want to see things move forward in a better way. And so that's the practical bottom line. And so you invest a great deal of time in recruiting and processing, hiring, onboarding, all of that to bring people into organizations. Want the very best you can find. One time I was hanging out. How many of you have ever heard of Ken Blanchard, the 1 Minute Manager? And he's written a ton of books too. I was hanging out with him one time. Weird long story. I'm not going to tell it. But we were walking around, and I overheard him say to somebody, "It's unfortunate that we put a lot of energy into hiring people that we think are winners, get them in our organizations, and then start treating them like they don't have a brain in their head, like they're losers." Right? So we don't want to do that. That's counterproductive, and it's not very good budget management either, for that matter. And turnover is expensive. If those people aren't happy and they leave their jobs, it costs a lot, practically speaking, to replace them, to bring someone else in. So what I say is we need to lead without blame. We need to emphasize, because of the nature of our world. How many of you have heard the term VUCA? VUCA? Anybody? Well, it's floating out there. It came out of the U.S. Army War College, actually. It stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. You know how the Army likes to acronymize things, right? Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And a few years ago, when some business people heard about this new VUCA military thing, they went, that sounds a lot like our marketplace. That sounds a lot like our industry is being lately. That sounds a lot like what's going on in our world, too. We want predictability, but what we discover is uncertainty and volatility. Okay. So the way we respond to that is by emphasizing the ability to bounce back, resilience, learning, being able to learn our way through new challenges that we've never encountered before. The way we do that is fluency, which I'm going to talk a bit more about later. How do we have this capability to encounter the things we need to encounter? How do we get the best with the people that we have? Right? How do we support them? How do we help them give their very best? And how do we produce value through team motivation? Because so much of our work these days is done in teams. And we don't talk about that very much. We talk a lot about individual motivation, but we don't talk about what motivates a group to move forward. So that's what this book is about, and that's what I'm going to touch on. So, have you ever lived this story? You were working along, everybody becomes aware. Something didn't go the way we thought it was going to, and not in a good way. We weren't pleasantly surprised. We were unpleasantly surprised. It was disappointing. So what happens next is we call a meeting. Right. I wrote a book about retrospectives. That's not the kind of meeting this is. This is a post-mortem meeting. We're gathering around because something died. Our idea of what was supposed to happen didn't happen. And now what? People coming to this meeting are getting very busy getting their fingers ready to point at somebody else so that the blame doesn't fall on them. Right? And does this sound familiar at all to anybody in the room? Okay. Yeah, right. So instead of getting really busy and what do we need to do in response to this? The meeting turns into one where we try to find the culprit. We want to find the scapegoat, the one person or one department or something that we can blame for this. Which gets us what? The satisfaction of not being the person blamed. We dodged another bullet. The years of passive aggressive behavior. Yes, right. Right. Does it move us forward? No. No, it's a waste. It's a waste of our time. And here's where my pragmatism kicks in. I am unwilling to waste time with blame. And by and large, most things we're trying to blame people for aren't individual issues. They are systemic issues, right? So we're even looking in the wrong place. So when I talk about blame and shame, what am I talking about? So in the book, we have these two definitions. Blame, when we blame, we censure, invalidate, judge, discredit other people. We rarely blame ourselves. That comes next. Yeah. So we imply that they are somehow faulty or inadequate or not good enough people or good enough workers, right? Maybe they're morally irresponsible when we're blaming. Sometimes that comes into play. You just weren't accountable enough. So what often happens individually is we turn that blame into one of two things. We either get really busy trying always to not be the person who gets blamed, or we start doing change. We start feeling like we aren't good enough. We start feeling like, we're just a wrong, bad person, right? We just aren't what we need to be. But neither of those activities, again, move us forward. Right? Plus distress, exposure, mistrust, powerlessness. Okay, so some people did a study, and as it turns out, my dad, who passed away recently, was actually a rocket scientist. And he introduced me to Scientific American, the magazine. And it turns out there's a lot of cool stuff in that. He was on the team that in the 1970s created Voyager that's still out there bringing us back stuff. Pretty cool. And that's how we introduced me. There was an article in Scientific American. But then I also found this article, which was quite, had relevance for me, right? When dominant leaders go wrong, highly assertive managers may foster a selfish culture that hurts companies, right? This was in the edition October 2022. So it's only a couple of years ago. So the researchers, since you can't possibly read what's on that page, but if you go look it up, it's there. The researchers discovered that their conclusion was employees supervised by a dominant leader reported greater zero-sum thinking, right? You win, I lose. Actually, Linda was talking a bit about that. Are we thinking win-win? Are we thinking zero-sum? We can't both win. And as their supervisors subsequently revealed, these employees displayed fewer helping behaviors. So they're all out for themselves, very busy making sure there's a term CYA that has to do with making sure you're not the one that gets blamed. And the authors showed that an assertive or forceful approach to leadership could reduce cohesiveness and collaboration. What's that doing to the work? What's that doing to the work? Is it moving it forward? Not so much. So since I read that, I started digging deeper, and I discovered there's a whole theory base right now being worked on called self-determination theory at work. And as a part of that, the leadership part of that has been doing very much like these researchers did, comparing the impact of controlling dominant leadership with autonomy supported leadership. And discovering in today's world, when people need to be working and learning workers, and people need to be bringing their most creative selves to work, and they need to be collaborative, working together in teams, it's the autonomy supported leaders that get the best results. Just saying. So, that the conclusion is that kind of controlling, dominant, you're doing it wrong, pointing the finger kind of leadership actually keeps people from learning and performing well. Actually gets in the way of the kind of results that we're looking for. And in the book we say, when we feel blamed by others and shamed by ourselves, we cripple our ability to perform well. We end up putting a lot of energy into dealing with that is no longer available to be in collaboration, to be doing learning work, to be creative, to be producing. So leaders get caught in a trap. For years and years and years, the way leaders have been taught, and whether that's a manager or somebody with a management title or any other person in a leadership role. But I love this quote from Peter Drucker. So much of what we call management consists of making it difficult for people to do the work. Anybody here ever experienced that from your managers? It's like, who knows what I'm supposed to be doing here? Okay, so in 2024, that has not changed. Unfortunately, we still see a lot of this. And it's largely because leaders tend to lead in the way they were led, and their role models for leadership have, by and large, been, and now we're noticing where the other kinds of research is showing us that a lot of those controlling, dominant leadership styles, turns out there's a good proportion in titled leadership roles of people who are actually sort of sociopaths, right? Only in it for themselves, right? So, I mean, it's just sort of an interesting thing. And those leaders who might have been our role models do not deserve our emulation. They do not deserve us doing the same thing to other people that they did to us. So we can break free. How do we do that? So we have to, if we want to be effective leaders, we really need to rethink some of those habitual, organizationally habitual leadership behaviors. In Norm Kurtz's book, Project Retrospectives, a handbook for team reviews, he proposed something he called the retrospective prime directive. He was one of my mentors. I mean, he's still alive. He still is one of my mentors. But the retrospective prime directive, if you've never heard of it before, and if you do retrospectives, I encourage you to occasionally incorporate this in your retrospectives. Regardless of what we learn, we understand and truly believe that everyone did the best job they could, given what they knew at the time, their skills and abilities, the resources available to them, and the situation at hand. Once again, this points us back to what? Systemic sources of the things that happen that we don't like, right? If it has to do with what they knew at the time, it has to do with what kind of information was somebody getting? What was the information flow to them? Did they have adequate information? Was it a good skills match? Did we assign work to somebody that actually matched their best skill set? Right? Both systemic issues. How's work assigned? How does information flow? The other kind of resources available, tools, permissions to make decisions, budget, whatever it might be. And then the situation at hand, recognizing that, maybe something's going on at work that's getting in somebody's way, but also people have whole lives. We don't know if somebody, had a fight with their partner that morning before they started work, whether they're still at home or whether they had to make a drive to get there. We don't know. We don't know what all is going on in anyone's situation. So a person's best on any given day, the best they are capable of, is a combination of a lot of systemic systemic issues that might be happening, and VUCA, right? All of those volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous things that might be going on in their lives. So we want to think more systemically about how we look at issues before we start blaming people. So in terms of sort of rethinking habitual behaviors, what are some of the things that we need to do? On this slide, there is a QR code up there. That QR code would take you, if you want to go check it out, will take you to a site on the website, Comparative Agility, that has an assessment. And about a model I'm going to show you here in a second. And if you want to investigate that further, you might want to click through to that. So we call this the Learning Leaders 4 C's model. And the 4 C's are, we have to rethink what it means to be courageous in the workplace. If we are going to support people in this learning work, in this new learning work environment, we need to be modeling learning. And so moving away from the idea that somebody with a title or with status of one kind or another in the team, because of maybe their background or their seniority or whatever, we want to move away from assuming those folks have all the answers. Because nobody can anymore. We need to have the courage as leaders to say, when somebody brings us a question, if I don't know the answer, I'm going to say, I don't know the answer. And I'm going to follow that up with, let's go figure it out together. Let's go learn about this thing together. That, in today's work environment, that can take a lot of courage. Right? Just to admit that I don't have all the answers. And the other part is encouraging other people to ask questions, to not just wait for us to tell them what to do, but encourage them to have that spirit of inquiry and curiosity. So we're looking for that in people. We're looking for, when we're hiring people, we're looking for people who have that kind of attitude that is going to help them become the best possible learner. Right? The second C is compassion. And it has to do with, as we move into this world of more focus on learning work to help us deal with our VUCA issue. We need to understand that there will always be a learning curve. So if it's just a matter of increasing skill in some area, there's going to be a dip while people are sort of learning that new skill before they accelerate into really performing. So we've got to have some patience and some compassion for that. But we also need to understand that a lot of people have had not great relationships with learning. They had are discouraged from learning in some way. I mean, you hear all these people who, when they were younger, were told, "Oh, you can't draw, you can't sing, you can't do anything creative. It's just not in you," right? And people have to be able to get over that hump. Or they were maybe gay dreamers who really thought up great ideas, but in their classrooms and in their learning settings, they were punished for not being on focus all the time. So compassion, we need to value the willingness to learn and then support how that happens. The third one is confidence. And by this, I do not mean cheerleading, but have the courage to model learning and the compassion to support it. We then need to show that we have the confidence in our people that they can learn their way through any challenge. We've created environments where that's possible. And complexity. Finally, complexity. We live in a complex world. All of us who are in leadership roles need to have some understanding of the dynamics of being in having complex work, being in complex environments. And there's a lot of information out there about that now. And it's just a fascinating thing, and it helps us with our systems thinking, with our being able to think systemically. Complex adaptive systems is what we're dealing with, and so the better we can work with those, the better. So I've just dumped a whole lot of stuff on you. This is Chief. He encourages you to just sit for a minute, take 20 seconds, and think about what you've already just heard, and then we'll move on. Thanks, Chief, for that reminder to stop and reflect. Okay. So another model that we use in our book is what we call leadership through learning, where we really looked at teams and what's going on with teams and what do we need to know, what more do we need to know about the dynamics that are going on in teams these days when we do need to focus on cohesion and collaboration and getting things done through multiple people, not just individual contributors. So this is the model. It has a couple of different parts. In the middle is what we call the essential motivators, and around the circle we have the resilience factors. And this is intended to communicate that if we can move through those, we keep moving forward and upward. So let's start with the focus on teams and teamwork. So when I talk about teams in this context, I'm talking about groups of individuals who are engaged in the same work, moving the same thing forward. Now, that might be, like Amazon said, a 2 pizza team. That might be, 4 or 5 people or 7 people or so. There are some ways of working now that have a collective that breaks into intermittent teams. There's ideas around dynamic reteaming. All of that is really interesting. But the idea is understanding that where we need to head, what's truly agility, is resilient learning teams. Teams who can learn their way through any problem the world throws at them, any new learning challenge. And so that's what I'm talking about. It's very interesting because we used to ascribe always to high-performing teams. We thought high-performing teams, that's the ultimate, right? That's the best. But what we discovered was that teams who had gotten that label as high performers or who had ascribed it to themselves and had some of the characteristics of high-performing teams, which are great to focus on shared responsibility, have good motivators, ability to scale. That's all good. But many of them were brittle. And when the pandemic hit, they broke. They had figured out their way to be high performing. And when the world kind of changed, they had a hard time adjusting. We saw many instances of that. You may have seen that in your organization as well. So that's why Tricia and I began talking about, well, what is beyond that? And that is the ability when something like a pandemic comes along. And there were some teams out there who did that, who just said, okay, we got to adjust. They were high-performing teams who became resilient learning teams because they had the resilience to just look at the new landscape and figure it out. Right? Figure out what needed to happen next. And sometimes contribute to building the tools that are going to help things figure things out next. So the motivators, the 3 motivators are team purpose, team autonomy, and team co-intelligence. And that may sound familiar to Dan Pinksworth, purpose, autonomy, mastery, which applies to individuals, and I have no question about that. But when we're talking about team purpose, there's this additional element of we have to share it. It has to be something we can all sign on to. And team autonomy means we know how to make decisions together. We know how to manage our own work. We develop these other skills. And then co-intelligence is the need to understand what do we as a team have at our disposal for skill sets, for backgrounds, for perspectives, for knowledge, for domain understanding, all of those things, right? And to be able to know when, as a team, we're missing something. Where is our gap? How are we going to fill it? Do we bring in a new team member, or do we just identify a resource that we can draw on, or an asset we can draw on from time to time? And the interesting thing about the essential motivators is you have to have all three for a team. Here I talk about if you only have purpose and autonomy but no co-intelligence, you're not going to have high quality, because you need that co-intelligence to around testing and quality and stuff to be able to build a good team. If you only have purpose and co-intelligence but no autonomy, you're likely to build up dependencies and bottlenecks and things because you don't have a good boundary around your work. And then co-intelligence and autonomy with no purpose means people are just building stuff willy-nilly, whether it fits in any direction or not, right? So you really do need all three. So then I said there are 4 resilience factors. I want to go through these pretty quickly. The collaborative connection is about how do we as a team create that cohesion that we need to perform well as a team? How do we build those trusting relationships? And how do psychological safety, those kinds of things, that's that resilience factor. The stronger that is on our teams, the more resilient our teams. This one is conflict resilience. Now, this may sound more familiar to you too. We train people in conflict management and stuff, but conflict resilience is, do we have the wisdom to not get embroiled in destructive conflicts, but know when we're getting creative, constructive conflicts and take advantage of those and set ourselves up to be able to, when there are disagreements, I love the reference to the code of conduct, when there are disagreements, when things come up, how do we handle those? How do we notice when those are the clash of ideas that might take us in a good direction if we can sort of make that all additive instead of either or when is it a conflict that's devolving into like a personality conflict that's destructive to the team, that kind of thing. How do we handle things when they're small? Are we giving good peer-to-peer feedback? There's a huge conflict technique, right? And then inclusive collaboration. There's also been a lot of emphasis at this conference on DEI and inclusion and so on. That is also part of the future. All the ways in which we can build diverse teams that are specific to the needs that we have for moving in the direction we want to move. So do we know how to be good bystanders and allies, for instance, in our team? Do we know how to value the different perspectives and values and backgrounds and not get embroiled in who's better than. And then those first three, you've probably run across in some team building kinds of things or something, you know, maybe all three of them, maybe just one or another, but they're fairly common. What we don't see a lot for teams is the understanding of power dynamics and the way that can get in the way of our learning and get in the way of our work. Because power dynamics can come from a lot of different things. They can come from organizational hierarchy, but they can also come from differences in seniority. They can also come from factionalization in our teams. We tell a story in the book about a team who had, I think it was like a 7 or 9 person team, and the both were in Boston, and either 3 or 5 were in Colorado, and they were trying to figure out when to have some of their meetings. And the geographic faction in Boston, decided they wanted to have their meetings right before lunch, which was a hardship for the people in Colorado because that was exactly the time of day that they needed to be getting their kids to school. And yet the group in the part of the team in Boston overrode them, all majority rules. Right? So those kinds of power dynamics can be very destructive on teams. So we want to look for power with, not power over. Because the power pie can be infinitely big. So we know that leaders intend to make a positive difference. Leaders intend to support what's going on, but sometimes the actions that we take as leaders don't reflect that intention. So we need to look for our impact and understand that being in a leadership role is difficult. And we might need support for that. Oh, there's Chief again. So you get another 20 seconds to think about the essential motivators and resilience factors. And we're getting close. You know, when I first started doing this, I gave people the cats gave people a minute. And we discovered that was much longer than most folks need. So 20 seconds seems to be about right. Thanks, Chief. So learning leaders ask questions. How do we cultivate the skilled teams that produce the benefits that we need in our business or to get our product out the door or whatever it might be? What do we have to already build on? What can we build on? And let's discover more about that. So in 2013 and in 2018, at one point it was me, and one time it was James Shore and I, we presented on this Agile Fluency model, which is one of the tools that you can use to sort of figure some of this stuff out. So the Agile Fluency model, you can find out more about it at agilefluency.org. But we created this model in response to the idea that there was the one true Agile. You know, there was the only one way to do Agile right. And if you weren't doing it that way, you were doing it wrong. That didn't match James and my experience at all. We noticed that different companies were building different kinds of products for different kinds of customers, might need different kinds of, they might have to adjust it some. And that there were some fundamental underlying principles that we needed to pay attention to. But what kinds of fluency, what kinds of skills and proficiencies a team might need vary. And that would produce this model. And then Out of that, we also realized that that meant organizations and leaders needed to make different investments in order to get to the teams that they needed to produce what they needed to produce. So again, this is there's a whole article associated with this that we created as an ebook that you can download at agilefluency.org. If this looks interesting to you, I'm not going to go into depth on it here. And some of you may have already seen it when we were here before. So I'm going to come back to this question. What is the practical bottom line here? We really want to move away from leading with blame to leading without blame. We want to move away from dominant control to autonomy, supporting kinds of leadership, the 4 C's leadership that helps learners, the leaders themselves become learners and helps them create an environment for learners and get the people best with people that we already have. And here are some ways to get in touch with me. If you don't want to buy the whole book, but you just like an excerpt, you can click on that, send a message to onward@dianalarsen.com, and we'll supply that for you. I brought a, no, I didn't take it out. I brought a copy if you want to look at it. It's in my backpack over there. Yeah, so my invitation to you is to go forth and lead, and by so doing, activate. Thank you. Now, these are the curious kittens. These are my grandkittens, Wayman and Evelyn, for those who get that joke. And I just want to say that we're almost at time. I've got about 5 minutes. If you want to ask questions now, please feel free. Or at any time you find me, I will be hanging out and all through the rest of the conference. So I am a big fan of the hallway track. Sitting someplace and having conversations part of conferences. So feel free to come find me. Thank you.